Coming up on UGTV, Board of Commission meeting of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
So I'm going to start with a bit of a reflection and then go into the prayer. Daniel Berrigan died last Saturday. He was a Jesuit priest who worked against nuclear weapons and their potential for suffering and destruction. He served time in federal prisons for his beliefs. I want to share his poem, Some, on this day of Cinco de Mayo. I think the poem reflects the spirit of the Mexican people as they moved their regional differences into unity to fight the French. Their unity brought them to a victory in the struggle for their country. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. It's too much, they cried. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. I've had it, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth. They walked the waters. They walked the air. Why do you stand, they were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children, they said. Because of the heart, and because of the bread. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. So let us join our sisters and brothers that are praying across the street, and we pray. God of the sum and God of all, help this commission to be the sum, that their efforts toward the common good in this community may always be their agenda. And I pray in the name of our brother Jesus, amen.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Sister Therese, for being here. We appreciate it. Ms. Cobbins, are there any revisions to tonight's agenda?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, a blue sheet has been distributed. Under Section 7 Consent Agenda, we have a clerical error for item number 4, which is the joint ordinance resolution to amend the election process. Correct Section 5 regarding Ordinance 2382, changing the odd number years to even number years, making the terms of the commission appointments to the boards and committees coincide with the commission elections. It also clarifies that local elections take place on Tuesday succeeding the first Monday in odd number years. Under the administrator's agenda, we have additional information. It's item number 1. That information contains a copy of a signature page of the MOU for the IBEW from January 2nd, 2015 through December the 31st, 2014 through January the 2nd, 2015 in the MOU that's effective January 1, 2015 through December 31, 2017.
All right, thank you very much. I'd now like to bring us to our consent agenda. Does any member of the commission, staff, or citizen in attendance tonight wish to set aside an item on the consent agenda? You need to step forward at this time. Any item not set aside will be voted on by a single vote.
Second.
Let the record show no one is moving forward to set an item aside. It is properly before us. Roll call.
Roll call. Bynum.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye.
Mugia.
Aye.
Kane.
Aye.
Markley.
Aye.
Walters. Philbrook.
Aye.
The vote is 9-0. That motion carries.
The next item is a commissioner's agenda. It's a travel request from Commissioner Townsend. It's listed as the last item. It should be listed here, so we're going to handle it here.
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. Seeing no comment, roll call.
Roll call Bynum.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye.
Mugia.
Aye.
Kane. Markley.
Aye.
Walters. Philbrook.
Aye.
The vote is 9-0. That motion carries.
All right, that brings us to our standing committee's agenda. The first is a municipal parking garage. This was unanimously voted by Commissioner McKiernan's standing committee, and the only reason it is not on consent is because it's been fast-tracked.
Move to approve as forwarded from committee.
Seeing no comment, it is properly before us. Roll call.
Roll call Bynum.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye.
Mugia.
Aye.
Kane. Markley.
Aye.
Walters. Philbrook.
Aye.
The vote is 9-0. That motion carries.
That brings us to our memorandum of agreement. I do have a question for legal. Can we adopt both of these with a single vote?
Yes, it is one resolution and containing both items.
Second.
Seeing no comment, roll call.
Roll call Bynum.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye.
Mugia.
Aye.
Kane. Markley.
Aye.
Walters. Philbrook.
Aye.
The vote is 9-0. That motion carries.
All right, that brings us now to our presentations of our updates of several studies that we've been working on, and I'll turn that over to Mr. Rob Richardson.
Thank you, Mayor. Commission members, Bridget's passing down the copies of the slides I'm going to be going through this evening. As you know, we have 3 ongoing projects. We have the K-32 Transportation and Redevelopment Study with the Quiet Zone Analysis. We have the Rosedale Master Plan and the Sign Code Rewrite. I'm going to briefly touch on K-32 and the Rosedale Master Plan, and then as the sign code is going to be before the Planning Commission on Monday, I thought I would give a more in-depth review of that this evening. Currently on the K-32 study, the consulting team is working with the various cities on issues relevant to each particular jurisdiction. On June 6th, they'll have their next advisory committee meeting at 6 p.m. in Edwardsville. And then on June 29th and June 30th, they'll have their final public meetings on the transportation redevelopment plans. Those will be, one will be at the Neighborhood Resource Center, and the other will be at the Edwardsville Community Center. Moving on to the Rosedale Master Plan, the consultant is working on some final details related to different big ideas that the document has. They haven't really started writing all the final text, but a lot of the conceptual things are into final detail mode. We are in the midst of our last series of public hearings, or public meetings on this. We held one yesterday, and we will hold 2 more next Thursday. One will be at noon at this Our Savior Lutheran Church, and the other will be at 6:30 p.m. at the Rosedale Middle School. The noon meeting that day is an added meeting. We had a glitch in sending the postcards out, and so we did that meeting yesterday, but I'm going to redo it just to make sure that everyone has notice throughout the community. So for remaining issues, and these aren't necessarily in any order, but I would say Mission Cliffs density in the Mission Cliffs area, that's a current issue that there's kind of 2 proposals, one that's more single family and one that's more medium density townhouses to lower density apartments, and they're voting on those in the public meetings. They're trying to figure out the right road diet for 43rd and 47th Street. Some of the merchants along 47th Street, for instance, would like more on-street parking, and the citizens would prefer bike lanes, I think, and so we're trying to sort that out. South of 43rd on Rainbow, you know that the east side of the street there is more single-family in nature, and so we're talking about density, but really height in those areas along Rainbow between 43rd Street and then 46th Street, where essentially the Woodside project is under construction and a future phase will be completed. There's also a question on 43rd Street from Rainbow to State Line about density there, because there's currently commercial zoning for most of that, even though there's several houses along the way there. And in the future, you know, obviously some of that retail there is probably ripe for some type of redevelopment in the near future. And so what kind of density would be appropriate in that area? We also have different options for Rainbow Boulevard from 39th to the county line. And one of those options is 2 one-way pairs. So the existing Rainbow would become the southbound lanes, and then you would split out to Adams for the existing Rainbow would be the northbound lanes. It's hard for me to say north and go downhill. You always go up north, and that confuses me, so sorry about that. The northbound lanes would go on the existing Rainbow down the hill, and then you would split did I say that wrong again?
No, you got it right.
All right. And then to go south, you would be on Adams to approximately Olathe, or just beyond Olathe. At Southwest Boulevard and Rainbow, there's a couple of issues there. One is the congestion there is going to increase as the medical center entities add 1 million square feet of new development just north of Rainbow Boulevard. Traffic is going to increase, and our studies indicate that 75 or 80% of that traffic is going to come from the south, which means that it will enter the area through this intersection. And so the consulting team has proposed 3 different traffic mechanisms to work on potentially resolve that. One is an alternate intersection style where the left-hand turns from southbound Rainbow onto Southwest Boulevard would be moved up on the bridge farther so that you could separate the signal timings there and allow those left turns to make their turn during another phase of the signal without adding a phase to the signal at Southwest Boulevard and Rainbow. Another option would be a northbound flyover. So you would, somewhere around Rainbow Extension, if you were going to continue north on Rainbow without getting onto Southwest Boulevard, you would actually fly over the intersection and rejoin the bridge, past or right about the grain elevator. And then the third option there is a new rail flyover, or new flyover that would cross the railroad tracks from Cambridge Circle to 31st Street. Much of the congestion at Southwest Boulevard and Rainbow is due to people turning left from southbound Rainbow to eastbound Southwest Boulevard to go to 31st Street or the Crossroads or downtown Kansas City, Missouri. And this would move some of that traffic down to a more appropriate intersection, divide the traffic up, and allow both intersections to operate at a reasonable level of service. Obviously, each of these has a price tag with it that we would have to work through in the future. You're all aware that you saw a presentation, I believe, last week regarding the new hotel facility and Applebee's redevelopment. The first 2 of these make a pedestrian walkable environment there without moving into that property pretty difficult because you're going to be starting bridges and flyovers and expanding the intersection there. The flyover on Cambridge would allow that to be more appropriately pedestrian-friendly, bicycle-friendly in that area. Another issue we have is, and was discussed quite extensively yesterday, were the appropriate location for bike lanes, whether those should be on Rainbow or on Adams or on another street, and how we should design the bike circulation through the area. We actually had some lively discussion yesterday. We haven't had that much in any of our public meetings. They've been pretty cordial, but that was one of the issues that we addressed. The future of public meetings here, as I said, we held one yesterday, and we will hold 2 meetings next Thursday, one at noon at Our Savior Lutheran and one at 6:30 at Rosedale Middle School. It's scheduled to be presented to the Planning Commission on July 11th and then Board of Commissioners on July 28th. On to the sign code rewrite. A little bit of background. In the summer of 2015, the Supreme Court decided the REED v Gilbert case, which basically changed 100 years of how we've dealt with signs and sign codes and made portions of our code unconstitutional. In addition to that, our old code was fairly difficult to use and confusing. To some degree, sign codes are that way, zoning codes are that way, but it was particularly more confusing than most. You all appointed an advisory committee. Each commissioner appointed a business representative and a neighborhood representative to that committee, and they've had 5 meetings. We've had 4 rounds of public meetings that generally had very low attendance. But we did have, at each of those meetings, or at each round of those meetings, representatives of the sign industry. Representatives from Luminous Neon, a lobbying group in Kansas, and Young Sign Company was represented at each of those rounds. We have distributed the drafts of the code widely over the last 3 or 4 weeks. You all should have received, with today's email that you may not have seen yet, 3 versions of the sign code. You all received this afternoon the draft that I'm discussing this evening. But it is a big change. There's a lot of detail to it, and we wanted to make sure you all had plenty of time to soak it in before it came to you for a vote. We've had very little comment on it, but I think that we've been able to resolve all of the comment that we've had so far, and I don't know of any negative comments to date, but like I said, our public involvement has been pretty low, and quite frankly, the advisory committee attendance hasn't been great, but those that have been there, especially Tony Privatera with Mark One Electric, a major property owner, has been very helpful in discussing different issues, and I think that you'll see several members of the advisory committee testifying at Planning Commission. And I would also note that White Smith LLC has been our consultant in helping develop the sign code. So our purpose in the sign code has been to assure that we're constitutional under REED and other laws and court cases. The new ordinance will regulate the structure and placement of signs, not what I would call the copy or the words or the text or what the sign says. We want it to be more flexible. We want to provide clear definitions and code requirements. A really significant issue when you rewrite a code is creating nonconformities, and we think that we've developed a code that does not create additional nonconformities. That is something that I don't have the staff time to deal with, and they're confusing and quite frankly just a pain in most cases for everyone involved. And so we did not want to create any nonconformities. We wanted to keep the field level. We didn't want people building signs, if you assume that this was passed in May, if somebody's building a sign in June, you don't want them to have additional rights to signage that somebody in May didn't have necessarily. And we want to reduce variance requests. A couple of the, and special use permit requests, quite frankly, for that matter. And I'll talk about a couple of those provisions as well. The format of this is that we have extensively expanded the definitions of signs so that it's clear what we're talking about. When this goes into our ENCODE system that we're working on to make, that allows people to go out and find properties that would be available for sale or lease where they want to start a business, it will also do sign calculations, but all of the definitions will be hyperlinked. So if you come into the code through ENCODE and you see a word that's defined, it will hyperlink to that definition. We have a written description, and we have pictures and charts that help to clarify what we're talking about. So this is an example of how we've done definitions with awnings, canopies, marquees. You see there's the word that you would be looking for, the text description, and then a picture that would describe what that sign is. This is far and beyond what we have today to help us navigate the sign code. Each one also has a chart, so you'll see across the top the various districts, whether it's permitted, whether you have to get a permit for that sign, if there's a number regulated per street frontage, how many each business can have, if you're in a single family district or a single tenant building or a multi-tenant building, if those sign requirements are different, the dimensions of the signs, the locations, and whether or not it can be digital, how it can be illuminated, very descriptive about how that sign can be developed. The other thing I will say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but right now we don't, in our code, we say you can have one sign on each facade of the building. And the new code will give you an allocation that says you can have up to 4 signs and you can decide how and where you put them. So this would say that if you're going to have a sign on your awnings, then that would count as one of your signs, part of your allocation table, how big it can be, and then you subtract that from your total allocation. But I'll describe that a little bit in more depth in just a moment. I want to talk about some key policy changes. One of them is in the prohibited sign category. To my knowledge, I think we've only issued one sign permit for a pole sign in the community since I've been here, and that was for the self-storage at 78th and I-70. They look old. Most new businesses don't want to build the new signs because old-looking signs, they want to look new and modern. And so we've added those to the prohibited list because there hasn't been a demand for them. The sign companies didn't object to that. And we've added a requirement, if you're going to reface a pole sign, like you're going to take the old sign out, put a new face in it, that you would put a pole cover on the pole itself that would enhance the look of the pole and help with the maintenance of that pole. So it's not just a paint chipped pole that we have out there. This isn't necessarily a new requirement, but I would just note that when you put up a sign, that the permit number of the sign permit needs to be placed on the sign. We didn't make any changes to the recent Billboard codes that we changed to allow the digital conversions. Those are remaining as they are. I mentioned a little bit that we're moving to an allocation system versus defining and allowing various types of signs. And this really hits home in what you would refer to as a garage sale sign, a political sign, a grand opening sign. I'll talk about that more later, but we have an allocation for temporary and incidental signs now versus allowing them by type. Another big change that I think was very positive for the folks from the sign industry was that currently, if you put signs on your building, we measure a square box around the outside of all your signage, and that has to be 7%. Now we're allowing, in the proposed code, up to 4 signs on the facade. Each one would have a box around that sign, but the total would be 7%. So, for instance, Walmart got a variance. I believe they did. They either got a variance or figured out a way to fit within the 7%, so they could have Walmart, their star, and food and home on the front of the building. This would allow that to happen without a variance. We haven't ever denied one of those, and so one of the things that we look at when we write the code is when we've had several variance requests and we haven't denied them, it should become part of the code. Murals will now be allowed by conditions. We don't currently allow murals, but we have several of them in different ways, and I think this will also allow some districts to create some character. Along Central Avenue, for instance, we talked about doing a special district for Central Avenue, but I think that this condition allowing murals with the conditions associated with it will allow them to create that district without having a special district or additional regulation. We allow projecting signs now with conditions. Roof signs are allowed now with conditions. Sandwich board for commercial businesses along a sidewalk would be allowed with certain conditions. One of the touchier things with the way the Supreme Court decision came out is flags. Flags will now be regulated as signs. Everyone will be allowed to have flags, but we won't regulate what those flags say. So one place that will appreciate this is the Startup Village, because they can now have their Startup Village flags, and we don't regulate what it says or anything. You can have an American flag or a Startup Village flag or a Royals flag or whatever you want. We don't regulate the copy of it. We define feather signs, so these are the signs that you see, the phone companies are infamous for their feather signs. We do allow them with some restrictions now, so that they're very popular. The sign companies didn't really care because most of the people buy those out of a catalog, so there's really not any local business here, but from the business community, they do like those for temporary advertising. We've also added a criteria that when seeking a variance, that part of the variance analysis would be that if your sign, for instance, you've got a big name and your sign allocation is small, you could ask for a variance because you couldn't print your name at a scale that was legible. So you would need a bigger sign because, for instance, Schlitterbahn has a really long name versus Wendy's. And the sign allocation may not allow them to build a sign that was visible and legible based on the speed of the road that people were traveling next to them. So that gives us a good criteria to look at when looking at variances. Another key policy change is digital illumination. As you know now, Anybody that wants to do a digital sign has to come through for a special use permit. We would now generally allow digital illumination with the criteria that you see there. One of them, interestingly, that the neighborhood groups talked about was they don't want those signs are generally brighter, even when you turn them down at night, than our other signage. And so if you're going to have a digital sign adjacent to a residential area, you'd turn the sign off from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. And you see the other features there of that. Those are kind of similar to what you've seen in other staff reports on special use permits.
Rob, I just have a question
Sure.
for you real quick. When you were talking about digital signs and having to turn them off next to residential areas, I see that a little bit. But then I also see other urban neighborhoods, where there are big cities, that there are condos and flashing neon signs 24/7. Did you get complaints about that or something? I'm not objecting.
We've heard a little bit in other meetings, but if you're so you live in a house and a business wants to convert their sign, and then it goes from an internally illuminated sign or a sign that has a floodlight on it that doesn't create a lot of extra lumens across the property line to one that is very bright and shines right at your window. That's a change. Now, if somebody were to build a sign and the sign was there and then we have an apartment building move in next to it, I wouldn't make the commercial business change because somebody moved in next to them. But when you're moving the new bright sign in next to somebody's existing home, I think it will avoid conflict that way. And from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. is not, we debated the timing of that and when that should start, and quite frankly, we could probably modify that a little bit, but it seemed like the neighborhood representatives on the advisory committee and the sign companies thought that was a good compromise.
I just don't want to take away from the character of urban living versus
Right.
suburban living. And you look at Times Square, I know it's much bigger, but you look at Times Square, you look at Chicago, any major metropolitan area in the urban setting. That's the great thing about it. There's nightlife 24/7, there's something going on, and people choose to live there. You would think that they'd be buying into that lifestyle.
And I think that we could come up with a way to do that, and if we had that type of a district. But if it's a church on 55th Street and you've got a subdivision next to you, that's kind of always suburban, right?
Okay, as long as there's some flexibility, professional discretion there.
So I'm going to highlight incidental signs pretty extensively here, because this is, if you note the definition here in examples, these are real estate signs, election signs, opinions, placards, construction signs, grand openings, special events. This isn't to limit what those are, but just as when you're changing the code and trying to let people understand what we're talking about, when we say incidental sign, this is what we're talking about. So as politicians, I thought you might be interested in this. For the standards, and these are pretty small, but it kind of defines what they are. These are the little yard signs, basically. During holidays, display periods, setbacks, other things, we talk about that in the standards for these signs. But we also have a table that I'm going to flip to here in just a second that I think more particularly describes where the interest would be. You see that they can get bigger the farther setback they are, et cetera. So in this table, and I'm going to draw your attention particularly to line number 4 and the number of allowed. And so for basically the residential districts and the residential traditional neighborhood design districts, office districts, basically we say there's a limited number of 2 incidental signs. And that the sign area for those in the lower residential districts would be a combined 36 square feet. And then as you go up, they would go to 48 square feet. So I suppose if you wanted to have a longer sign that was 3 feet tall, so you could put 3 signs next to each other and you'd stay under your 32 feet. There's a way to put more than one, politician's yard sign in the yard and still stay under the 2 sign maximum. But I was a little worried about 36 square feet. A typical yard sign's about 6 square feet. And this is all the time, every day of the year, 24/7. Now, most people are not going to do that, but it's difficult to say that during the political season you can have more incidental signs, because we're afraid the court is going to say, you're just regulating political signs differently, because there's no other reason for you to have that. And quite frankly, for instance, this year, the political season would go from whenever the first primary was through the general election. So it's pretty much 9 months that you would have the signs up potentially. But like I said, the number of those and the temporary and incidental signs, the number of those is regulated by allocation in the commercial districts, and I'll show you that in just a moment. It's really by allocation and not by number. So if you're an M2, you could have a 300 square foot sign, but generally in M2 and M3, you have huge lots. The setbacks are larger, and so we thought that the variation there would be different. And in the commercial districts, you have more demand for temporary and incidental signs. I think that 36 square feet is probably a little high on the residential all the time, because if you have a neighbor that has a bone to pick, they're going to have signs out all the time. But we have to balance that with people's need for other types of speech during other times of the year. Under the new Supreme Court case, for instance, Merry Christmas is a sign. It just has to be, because we can't regulate what it says. We just have to say that it's a sign. So we thought that would cover Christmas and political season and everything else at 36 square feet, but it definitely could have a downside, but this is kind of what the court has left us with. So I put the previous sign code table up here. You can see it really deals with wall signs and detached signs, and there's different categories and everything within each one of those. Lots of special requirements and divisions that are hard to read. But if you go to the new code, you basically have attached signs, how many you can have per facade, and the area of those. Detached, how many you can have, the area of the sign. And there's a couple of notes associated with this, but in general. And then temporary signs. This is the chart that we just looked at, basically. How many you can have in the area of those. And if it's blank, then it's not the number is not limited. So this is kind of the most referred to part of the sign code, this table. And you can see how much simpler it is than the previous code. Not that there's not a lot of detail and other definitions and things with the code, but when people want to know, how do I do my signs on the front of my building, you can have 4, they can be 7%, that's it, you're done. And that's where we get most of our questions, and I think this is an easier way to do that. And it's constitutional under the new code, because we don't talk about what the sign says. It's either attached to the building, detached from the building, or it's a temporary or incidental sign, and they're regulated independently of that, and not by what they might say. So the schedule from here, Monday, May 9th, we'll be at Planning Commission for a public hearing. On the 26th, I'm assuming that we will be here before you for your review and public comment. If anyone has comments related to the sign code, or if anybody watching on TV would like to get a copy of the proposed code, it will be on the Planning Commission web agenda that's going to be out tomorrow afternoon, or you can email me and I can send you a copy of it. The last thing I put on here was a comment from Ann with Young Sign Company, saying that she'd been glad and involved, and she thought we'd strive to have a code that was fair and provides opportunity for the businesses in our community to succeed. She said I could include that for you all tonight, and I thought that was a pretty good summative comment from our public involvement.
I just wanted to say, could you tell the committee of citizens that have worked on this, from all of us, a sincere thank you, because that's a lot of work, and I bet it's not always very exciting. So I'm delighted by it, but I sincerely want to thank those folks who spent their time working with you and your staff through this process. I did have a question on the master planning, if we can go back to that. I don't know where we are in your presentation.
I believe that, yeah, that was the last slide. So where do you want to go back to?
Dale, you had talked about some traffic mitigating at Rainbow and Southwest Boulevard, and a concept for dealing with that traffic, especially that turning eastbound. So I might getting ahead of myself, but a lot of what happens there is those folks coming off of I-35 onto southbound 7th Street, they just start jockeying. So they're jockeying to get over to the left, and I'm trying to get to Rosedale Barbecue, so I'm jockeying to get to the right. And I might be getting ahead of myself, but does what you describe deal with that?
Yes, to some degree. The alternate intersection style would not do so much for the southbound. The flyover would not do so much for the southbound, but if you did the Cambridge Circle change, that would be something that would prevent a lot of that jockeying. We also think that with the Cambridge Circle change, we might be able to have some bi-state cooperation with that, because we think it would really help their businesses to let people get to them more expeditiously than fighting the traffic at 7th and Southwest Boulevard and then another stoplight on the way. So the phenomenon you're describing is very true if you're going to Rosedale Barbecue or somewhere on that, and you're coming from the downtown side, because from here it's easier to go I-35 than down 7th Street. It's a little bit faster. So then you're doing all the crisscross with the southbound traffic, and it does get a little hairy, especially in rush hour.
All right. Is that it?
That concludes my presentation.
Any of the commissioners have anything else to bring before the body? Any questions? Meeting adjourned.
Great job, Hal.
You taking the book? Yeah, I get the easy part.